Nations must cooperate on climate change or they will perish. A stark warning from the head of the UN. As world leaders gather in Egypt, Antonio Guterres says progress on cutting emissions since last year's summit has been woefully inadequate.
That 1.5-degree goal is on life support and the machines are rattling. We are getting dangerously close to the point of no return.
We'll find out what the prospects are of progress in combating emissions. We'll be live in Egypt, also this lunchtime. The growing political row about Gavin Williamson and his expletive-laden text messages. Number 10 says the Prime Minister retains full confidence in the minister. Democratic presidents past and present head out on the campaign trail on the eve of the US midterm elections.
My name's Kendra and I like watching telly.
There's a rise in the number of children needing help with speech and language, particularly among those who started school after the first COVID lockdown. And a global medical first. Blood grown in a laboratory has been given to people in a clinical trial.
And coming up on the BBC News channel, Southampton sacked manager Ralph Hasenhüttl following yesterday's Premier League defeat against Newcastle, which left the club in the relegation zone.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the BBC News at 1. The head of the United Nations has warned the COP27 climate conference in Egypt that nations must cooperate in the effort to reduce global emissions or perish. Antonio Guterres described the progress made since last year's gathering in Glasgow as woeful. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is expected to warn world leaders later that it's essential that countries stick to the commitments made then to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Delegates have now agreed to discuss sending money to poorer nations to help them deal with climate-related losses. Our climate editor, Justin Rolat, reports from the conference.
The world leaders swept into the conference centre in the Egyptian desert this morning. Among them, the British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. There was a formal handshake with the UN chief. All 120 world leaders at the talks get one. It marks the formal start of what looks set to be some of the most fraught discussions in the 3-decade history of these climate summits. Fraught because the Egyptians say this conference is all about delivering on the promises made at Glasgow last year. What that really means is coming up with cash to help the developing world tackle climate change.
We are in a political environment that's still suffering from the war, from distrust, and from geopolitical environment that is not really helpful to international cooperation. But at the same time, I'm seeing the opportunity.
The world is way off course. According to the UN, we need to almost halve emissions by 2030. At the moment, they're still rising. We are on track for warming of almost 3 degrees centigrade, a catastrophe for humanity, according to the UN.
The clock is ticking. We are in the fight of our lives and we are losing. Greenhouse gas emissions keep growing. Global temperatures keep rising, and our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible.
And the leaders of the biggest emitting countries aren't here. The Chinese, Indian, Russian and Indonesian leaders aren't coming at all. President Biden will be coming, but not until Friday. So is that likely to affect the outcome?
The Secretary-General has been very clear for a number of years that heads of state need to come. But at this particular moment in time, with relationships as difficult as they are, and countries have made major commitments, so all of these countries have net zero commitments by 2050, for the head of state to not come, well, maybe this is the year they can get away with it.
We've been forced to go.
So these talks are going to be difficult, but bizarre as this gathering in the desert is, it is the best hope the world has of progress on the climate issue.
And let's go straight to Sharm el-Sheikh and talk to Justin. But given that really blunt language we heard from the head of the UN, I mean, do you sense there is any optimism of progress, substantive progress on all of this?
You know, we always find a way for some progress at these talks, and obviously progress depends on who you speak to. I mean, there's some, as you heard in my report, demands from developing countries, you know, not just for millions of dollars, not just for billions, but for hundreds of billions, possibly in the future trillions of dollars. Will they get commitments to that now? No, they won't. But people like Mia Mottley, who's the Prime Minister of Barbados, Barbados, yes, sorry. She says, you know, what needs to happen is a change in the kind of financial architecture of the world community. So she's looking at changing the way the IMF lends money, the way the World Bank lends money, the way the World Trade Organization operates. And she says that might be able to free up lots of money to help developing countries transition away from fossil fuels and adapt to climate change. So there may be alternative routes to achieve some of the ambitions that everybody here talks about. And the key, I think, is this, that if we're going to get to the kind of huge amounts of money that people talk about, it won't simply be from governments. It's going to have to be finding ways to draw in private capital, private money, private investors into the process of both switching from fossil fuels, but also building the flood defences and so forth that we need to adapt to climate change. So this is, if you like, a discussion that goes now beyond governments and into the kind of hinterland of this conference, the huge numbers of people who are here to talk about business. So that perhaps is where a solution may lie.
All right, Justin, thank you. Justin Rolat in Egypt. Well, as that conference gets underway, climate change activists here brought England's busiest motorway to a standstill this morning. Sections of the M25 were closed throughout the rush hour as part of a protest by Just Stop Oil. Several junctions across Surrey, London and Kent were affected. Pressure is growing on Rishi Sunak to act as more details emerge of apparent threats made by a Conservative MP before he was given a ministerial position. Number 10 has confirmed that the Prime Minister was aware that a complaint had been filed against Sir Gavin Williamson about harassment and bullying. And as our political correspondent Ben Wright reports, there are also more questions about the reappointment of the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman.
It's a diplomatic debut for the new Prime Minister, but questions about his judgment have followed Rishi Sunak to Egypt. In particular, why he gave a big government job to Sir Gavin Williamson, who used some very undiplomatic language in a series of texts to the former Tory chief whip. On his way to Egypt, Mr Sunak said the messages were not acceptable, but opposition criticism continues.
It's so disappointing that yet again we're having a discussion about the Prime Minister's judgment, this time in relation to Gavin Williamson. He's clearly got people around the cabinet table who are not fit to be there. That's because he was so weak and wanted to avoid an election within his own party.
The Prime Minister insisted he hadn't seen the messages when he brought Sir Gavin Williamson back into government. The Tory party is investigating the matter, but it's not the only appointment drawing political flack.
Do we need a new deal with the French on small boats?
The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, is under intense pressure to sort out the asylum system, from the surge in small boat crossings to overcrowded conditions at the Manston facility in Kent. Today, a less than ringing endorsement from one of her cabinet colleagues, who briefly did the job himself last month.
A centre that was set up to be a processing centre, now this is at Manston Airport in Kent, was tipping into becoming an unofficial detention centre. I was very keen to ensure that we maintained ourselves within the law, had some very clear advice on that, and made a number of changes.
Rishi Sunak promised a government of integrity and accountability when he entered number 10. But these appointments are making it harder for him to try and present a clean break from the Tories' recent troubles. And look who popped up at COP.
I'm here as I'm a foot soldier and spear carrier of the Conservative. I'm here in a purely supportive role.
And with so many big issues facing the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak needs all the support he can find. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Rail passengers are being reminded that most train companies are running reduced services today, even though 3 days of strikes by the RMT union, including one scheduled for today, have been cancelled. The strikes were called off on Friday, but that was too late for many services to be reinstated. Let's find out more from our transport correspondent Katie Austin, who is at King's Cross Station in London. So still a lot of disruption for people, Katie?
That's right, and some passengers have been finding this really confusing. As you say, it was on Friday that the RMT called off these strikes to go into a period of intense negotiations, but there is still a lot of disruption around today, and there will be a little bit tomorrow as well. Now, the signal workers have been back at work since Saturday. The tracks are open, but not all train companies are able to take advantage of that and restore all their services. And I'm told a big factor in this is the availability of train crew, including drivers who weren't actually going to be involved in the strikes. But the rotas had, of course, been drawn up in advance for those very, very limited services you'd expect on strike days. And in a lot of cases, drivers, for example, would normally be given 7 days' notice of a change. So train companies, in many cases, are reliant on volunteers for people to step in and say they will work on what would have been a strike day. And some train companies are able to put on a lot more services or restore a lot more services than others. So it's a bit of a patchwork. A couple of operators back to a near normal service, a couple of them really not much more than the original strike day timetable. So there will be some disruption tomorrow morning as well. Things getting back to normal on Wednesday, but do check before you travel, because that might not be the case everywhere. And do remember, on Thursday there is a strike, but that's in London on the Underground and the Overground. That's still set to go ahead.
Katie Austin, thank you. The biggest ever strike by nurses in the UK is expected to be announced later this week in a dispute about pay. In advance of the probable walkout by members of the Royal College of Nursing, our health reporter Laura Foster has been talking to people who voted for and against action.
Exhausted, overworked, saddened.
Geraldine and Diane's feelings about their jobs are very different from when they started as nurses 7 years ago.
Do an extraordinary job.
They've both voted in favour of striking.
To be able to afford things in family life, I make sure I do extra shifts on the weekend, and I work full-time during the week, and I then also have to give up my weekend so I don't get to see my son.
I love being a nurse. I love what I do, but if financially I'm being impacted, everything else will fall apart. I don't want to wince at my bank account every month.
The Royal College of Nursing says a typical full-time nurse earns roughly the same as the average full-time worker in the UK. That's about £33,000. But the starting salary for a Band 5 nurse is closer to £27,000.
Nurses' salary who work for the NHS...
Karen uses TikTok to help people understand nurses' wages and disagrees with the idea that nurses should be happy with their pay.
If people genuinely felt £27,000 was a good salary, universities would be inundated with people applying to be a nurse. Nurses wouldn't be leaving in record levels. NHS will be retaining staff, and that's just not happening. So clearly that money is not enough.
So what happens if union members have voted for strike action where you live? Well, the union would give notice to the health trusts and boards where members have voted to go on strike. On an agreed date, those nurses would stop working. There would still be safe staffing levels in emergency care and for urgent services, similar to the number of staff there'd be on Christmas Day. There could be disruption to pre-planned appointments. Some might have to be cancelled. Ian in Cornwall is concerned strikes would be unsafe.
Our leader at the RCN, Royal College of Nursing, have said we will not be putting patients at risk. But during this crisis, during this nursing crisis, if we reduce the staffing levels any further, the only outcome could be patient safety. So this is the reason I voted no.
The Welsh Government and the UK Government, who are responsible for healthcare in England, say they've met the recommendations given by the independent NHS pay review body. In Scotland, the Scottish Government says that its pay offer means its staff will be the best paid in the UK. Meanwhile, in Northern Ireland, no formal pay offer has yet been made. Any strike action would cause disruption, but many feel they've been left with no alternative. Laura Foster, BBC News.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has said Russia is preparing its forces for a large-scale attack on his country's infrastructure, focusing on the energy sector. Ukraine's power supply has been cut by a third, and people are being urged to reduce their electricity use. More than 4.5 million people have experienced power cuts in the last month. Our Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse has been to the city of Kremenchuk in central Ukraine, one of the worst affected areas.
In this dark, a torch acts as an icebreaker. Light here is in short supply, and life is harder as a result. The Zamorsky family only have electricity for a couple of hours at a time. Some blackouts are planned and some aren't. 12-year-old Ilyana is under no illusions as to what's behind them.
They think Ukraine is weaker and will die soon because of power outages, and people will flee from here, making it easier for Russia to take over Ukraine.
Moscow is trying to pressurize places it can't reach.
Everyone understands it's not working. They can only make people angrier.
Russian strikes have reportedly destroyed a third of the country's power stations this past month. They're not influencing the battlefield, but they're forcing places like this nursery to adapt. A new generator from Poland becoming the latest toy. Some of these children have learning disabilities, and blackouts often coincide with air raid sirens.
I think if they come today, they will be killing us just because we're Ukrainians. We will buy gas cylinders, wood-burning stoves, generators. We will be standing until the end.
Russia wants to lower Ukraine's morale ahead of what will be a long winter. And yet, out of all the cities we've been through, there hasn't been one person who said, I want the war to end tomorrow because of these power cuts. Yes, they're being felt, but there's history at play. Ukrainians have always faced threats to their existence. It's why survival is central to people's identities. There is nothing this war doesn't touch or interrupt, regardless of where you are in Ukraine. James Waterhouse, BBC News, Kremenchuk.
The time is 17 minutes past 1, our top story this lunchtime. As world leaders gather in Egypt, the head of the UN warns nations must cooperate on climate change or perish. Still to come on the programme in the run-up to the Men's World Cup, Prince William and England players talk football and mental health.
Coming up on the BBC News channel, the draw has been made for the last 16 of the Champions League, and six-time winners Liverpool face a tough task. They have been drawn against Real Madrid.
This time it's Liverpool FC 6-2.
The number of children who need help with their speech and language has risen, particularly for those who began school after the first COVID lockdown. The BBC's Shared Data Unit found there are 10% more children in Year 1 in England who've needed extra help over the last year. And in some local authorities, that figure rises to 35%. NHS waiting lists are also at their highest ever for speech and language therapists, with some families having to wait more than a year. Our education reporter, Vanessa Clark, has the story.
I'm Zainab and I like cats. My name's Kendra and I like watching telly.
A vital skill for life, communication. For this group of children at Northwood Community Primary in Knowsley, this is an important catch-up session in the school's specialist language hub. Experts say repeated lockdowns had a serious impact on children's speech.
Children being at home and not being exposed to good language role models and not being able to interact in school, and have those conversations and that reciprocal flow, I think that's had a massive effect.
For 7-year-old Lewis, online learning and a lack of socialising with friends ended in frustration.
Have a good day, babes.
You couldn't hold a full conversation with Lewis. He'd point for a cup because he wanted to drink, because he was too nervous to tell me what he wanted in case I didn't understand.
There has been a 10% increase in children needing help with language skills, particularly for 5 and 6-year-olds. For Lewis, help by trained staff has made a huge difference.
Do that. I can hold a conversation with Lewis now. The school and the hub, like I could never ever repay them for what they've done for Lewis. He's such a better boy.
This issue does not just affect children who are directly impacted by the pandemic, but those coming after. There are significant waits for community care services, particularly for speech and language therapy. 65,500 children are currently on the waiting list, and that figure is rising.
We say,
In Scarborough, 3-year-old Seamus has been on the list for a year. His mum has been teaching him sign language.
We feel like if he'd been seen sooner, we would have been able to work on things a lot easier. Now I feel that he's sort of fallen behind again, and even though he's coming on so well, he's going to really struggle when he goes to preschool, when he starts school, because he's not had this catch-up time that would have made such a difference and might even have brought him up to where children of his age are.
The government says it is investing in training for early years professionals and is committed to putting students' education back on track after the pandemic. Seamus's family are hoping he won't have to wait too much longer to get the help he needs. Vanessa Clark, BBC News, Scarborough.
People across the US will vote tomorrow in decisive elections, the midterms. Currently, the Democrats have a majority in both houses of Congress, the Senate and House of Representatives. But if Republicans take control of one, then President Biden will find it difficult to get his plans approved into law. So these polls will ultimately shape the agenda for the next presidential contest in 2024. Here's Christian Fraser to explain more from Washington.
A midterm election is a barometer of the national mood. It's a verdict on the president's performance thus far, and the results of a midterm election will dictate what Joe Biden can achieve with the rest of his term. Of 596 Republicans running for statewide or federal office, 307 have raised doubts about the validity or the integrity of the 2020 election. And one of them is Kari Lake, who is running for the governor in Arizona, against the Secretary of State, currently in charge of elections, Katie Hobbs. Another is Doug Mastriano, running for governor in Pennsylvania against the Democrat and current Attorney General in Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. Mastriano is a Trump pick who in the primary season told voters that if he wins, he will choose a Secretary of State with the power to make corrections to elections. This time, more than ever before, state elections will matter. For if these election deniers win governor or Secretary of State positions, they will be empowered to decide the fate of the election in 2024.
Christian Fraser in Washington. A survey suggests a quarter of adults in the UK have savings of less than £100, while 1 in 6 people have no savings at all. The research was carried out by the Money and Pensions Service, which is backed by the government. It's urging people in financial difficulty to confide in loved ones and seek free advice. All captive birds in England, including free-range poultry, must be kept indoors from today to try to stop the spread of bird flu. More than 200 cases have been confirmed since October last year, and about 5.5 million birds have died or been culled. The risk to people from the virus is said to be very low. Liverpool will face Real Madrid in the last 16 of the Champions League. It's a repeat of last season's final, which was marred by chaotic scenes outside the Stade de France, when thousands of Liverpool fans, some targeted with pepper spray and tear gas by French police, were unable to get into the stadium. Now, blood grown in a laboratory has been given to people in a world-first clinical trial. Research teams from Bristol, Cambridge, London and NHS Blood and Transplant are testing tiny quantities, equivalent to a couple of spoonfuls, to see how it reacts inside the body. As our health correspondent Catherine Burns now reports, researchers used stem cells from donated blood.
5,000 people do this every day in England, but for patients with rare blood types, there might only be 1 or 2 people who can donate to them. Researchers hope to change that.
We're really excited because it's the first time we've been able to grow enough red cells from stem cells in the laboratory to transfuse into healthy volunteers. And we really think that this is going to be a possible way of making red cells in the future for patients who we currently find it really difficult to provide matched blood for.
It starts with a normal donation. Stem cells are isolated from the rest of the blood and put into a special solution for around 3 weeks. This encourages the stem cells to multiply and develop into red blood cells. These big containers have about 24 litres of solution, and they'll become about 1 or 2 teaspoons of red blood cells. So far, that's been injected into 2 healthy volunteers. It's a complex process, trying to recreate something our bodies do far more efficiently than any lab can right now. But scientists want to see if the lab-grown cells have some advantages over nature. This donation of blood will contain millions and millions of red blood cells. Some of them will be fresh at the start of their life cycle. Others, though, will be older nearer the end of theirs. And researchers hope that the lab-grown cells will all be new, meaning they could survive in the body for longer. The hope is that people who need regular transfusions would then not need them so often. This would help patients with conditions like sickle cell, disorders that affect red blood cells.
It would mean a lot having to not have so many blood transfusions. And also I wouldn't have the impact of the side effects from the blood transfusions that I have now. I do get allergic reactions.
All this comes during a blood shortage in England. This is not a solution to that problem. This trial is the first step of a long process. Even if everything works out, we will still rely on hundreds of thousands of donors giving their time and their blood. Catherine Burns, BBC News.
In the run-up to the Men's Football World Cup, the Prince of Wales has sat down with stars Harry Kane and Declan Rice to discuss difficult lessons learned from their shared love of the sport. The trio discussed their fondest football memories and the way it's bolstered their mental well-being. And as our royal correspondent Daniela Relf reports, Prince William joked that being a keen Arsenal Villa fan had taught him that disappointment is a part of life.
2 footballers and 1 royal fan who opened up about the challenges of supporting England.
You know, handling some of those really disappointing England results in the past, that was hard. I found that really difficult because, again, the same euphoria that we had comes crashing down and whittles away. And that's quite hard to take because you feel all on a high, you feel all together. And then suddenly normal life just gets back on again, and it's like, well, where did that all go? Was that real? What happened? And how do I get that feeling back? And yet football has that ability to just put it all on a plate for you and then suddenly just take it all away.
The Prince of Wales has spoken to a number of players in recent years about how they manage their own well-being. Football has become an effective way of communicating, of encouraging men in particular to open up, to share their worries, and to find the right help when they need it.
I follow after my role model here, you know.
In his latest conversation, there was a focus on England's agonising defeat to Italy in the Euro finals last summer. Harry Kane and Declan Rice told the Prince the loss and the recovery was a real test of their mental strength.
To come as close as a penalty shootout, and then in that moment, you're literally seconds away from having the biggest high you're probably ever going to have, to all of a sudden having one of the biggest lows you're ever going to have.
Togetherness we showed when we all come in a huddle after we'd lost that, and Gareth said some really, important words. And as a group, I think that brought us forward together, because then we had to qualify for a World Cup in the next round of games.
Whoever you are, whatever your life experience, open up and get the right help. The advice from this team of Prince and players. Daniela Relf, BBC News.
And it really is Aston Villa, of course, that the Prince of Wales was referring to. I really did know that. Some suggestion I may have said otherwise. Moving swiftly on, never good to engage in rival football teams. Let's talk about the weather prospects. Ben Rich is with me. How's it looking? Hello, Ben.
Hello, Jane. Thank you. It is looking quite turbulent, actually, for some of us over the next 24 hours or so. Already some fairly rough seas there for a weather watcher in Plymouth, and those seas are set to get a little bit rougher as we go through the rest of today into tonight. We'll see some heavy bursts of rain accompanied by some really squally gusty winds, and this is the reason why. This is our satellite picture, and this stripe of cloud here with a really clear back edge, that always shows us that we've got quite an active weather system on our hands, an active cold front which will swing its way eastwards as we go into tonight. It's going to bring a short, sharp burst of heavy, perhaps thundery rain and some really squally winds, some rough seas as well. There is some rain out there right now, but as you can see from the radar picture, it's quite sporadic in nature, quite a splodgy rainfall pattern. There are some drier gaps. That's the way things will continue really through the afternoon. Some particularly heavy and persistent rain, I think, across parts of southwest Scotland. Equally, southern parts of England, South Wales may see a little bit of sunshine before the day is done. Temperatures 12 to 16 degrees, a little above where we should be at this time of year. But through tonight, here comes our active cold front. Some heavy thundery rain, could be some hail thrown in, and along the line of that weather front, wind gusts of 50, 60, maybe 70 miles per hour, whipping up some rough seas. That could give rise to some coastal flooding. The intensity of the rainfall as it comes down in a short space of time, that could give some surface water flooding as well. It all moves northeastwards through the night, some showers following on behind. A mild night, a mild start to tomorrow. Now, tomorrow will stay quite windy. There'll be some spells of sunshine, but as you can see, some showers pushing from the west towards the east, some of which will be heavy and potentially thundery. They should blow through quite quickly given the strength of the wind. Those temperatures, again, a little bit above where they should be at this time of year. Those temperatures, though, are set to rise further as the week wears on. This is Wednesday. Again, sunshine and showers on the face of it, but signs that those showers will tend to ease as we go through the afternoon. A very weak ridge of high pressure trying to build in, so perhaps a little drier, a little calmer by the end of Wednesday. And then let me show you what happens towards the end of the week. We've got this warm front working its way through, some warmer air behind it, further frontal systems wriggling to the northwest of the UK, bringing some further rain at times and some brisk winds. But this setup will leave us in the midst of some really unusually warm air for the time of year. So these are the daytime temperatures we're expecting for Thursday and Friday. We're looking at values of 17 degrees. Given enough sunshine, I wouldn't be surprised if some places got just a touch warmer than that. The sunniest conditions will be found towards the south and the east of the UK, but with more rain and more brisk winds towards the north and the west. But in the shorter term, through tonight, a short, sharp burst of heavy rain and squally winds. Jane.
All right, Ben, thank you. Ben Rich with the weather prospects there. Just a reminder now of our top story this lunchtime. As world leaders gather to discuss climate change, the head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, says progress on cutting emissions since last year's summit has been woefully inadequate.
That 1.5-degree goal is on life support and the machines are rattling. We are getting dangerously close to the point of no return.
And that is it from the BBC News at 1 for today. Goodbye from the team here. On BBC One, we will join our news teams now, wherever you are. Hope you have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.